Hello, and welcome to the channel. Today, we're going to delve into a topic that's becoming more and more common in conversations. About modern church life, the role of women in leadership positions during worship. We're seeing a growing trend of women serving as preachers, teachers, song leaders, and even as elders. Many people believe this is a positive correction, suggesting that the traditional church structure was simply a product of a male-dominated society. The push is to see more women in the pulpit and in other key leadership roles. While leading worship is incredibly important, the core question we need to ask ourselves is this: does the Bible authorize women to preach or lead in the worship assembly when qualified men are present? To answer this, we need to turn to the scriptures themselves and see what they say. Let's start by looking at the book of 1 Corinthians. In chapters 11 and 14, the Apostle Paul addresses specific disorders that were happening during the worship services in the Corinthian church. He wasn't pleased with what he was hearing. In 1 Corinthians 11 verses 17 and 18, he writes, "Now in giving these instructions, I do not praise you, since you come together, not for the better, but for the worse. For first of all, when you come together as a church, I hear that there are divisions among you, and in part, I believe it." Pay close attention to that phrase. When you come together as a church, this isn't just about general Christian living. Paul is specifically talking about the official gathering of believers for worship. It's within this very context of the worship assembly that Paul lays out a principle of headship. In verse 3 of the same chapter, he says, "But I want you to know that the head of every man is Christ, the head of woman is man, and the head of Christ is God." Here, the word head signifies authority. This establishes a divine order of submission. God is the head of Christ, Christ is the head of man, and man is the head of woman. This isn't a statement about value or worth, but about roles and structure within the church and the home. It seems the women in the Corinthian church were not adhering to this principle, which was causing confusion and disorder. So, inspired by God, Paul gives a very direct instruction to correct the problem. Let's jump to chapter 14, starting in verse 33. "For God is not the author of confusion, but of peace. As in all the churches of the saints, let your women keep silent in the churches, for they are not permitted to speak. But they are to be submissive, as the law also says. And if they want to learn something, let them ask their own husbands at home, for it is shameful for women to speak in church." Now, many people today will argue that this was a specific cultural issue unique to the city of Corinth. They might say that the women were being disruptive, or that this was a temporary rule for a specific local problem. But notice Paul's language. He prefaces the command by saying, "As in all the churches of the saints," he explicitly connects the instruction for women to remain silent to a universal practice across all the churches, not just the one in Corinth. This wasn't a local suggestion. It was a command intended for all believers, indicating that this is a timeless principle, not a temporary cultural fix. To see if this idea is consistent throughout the New Testament, let's turn to another key passage. In Paul's first letter to Timothy, he's giving his young protege instructions on how Christians should behave. In 1 Timothy 3 verse 15, Paul explains his reason for writing, "So that you may know how you ought to conduct yourself in the house of God, which is the church of the living God, the pillar and ground of the truth." Again, the context is clearly about proper conduct within the church. So, what does Paul say about the roles of men and women within this context? Just before this, in chapter 2, he gives very specific instructions. He starts with the men in verse 8. "I desire, therefore, that the men pray everywhere, lifting up holy hands, without wrath and doubting." Notice he singles out the men to lead in public prayer. This sets the stage for what follows. Then he addresses the women. In verses 11 and 12, he writes, "Let a woman learn in silence with all submission. And I do not permit a woman to teach or to have authority over a man, but to be in silence." This is a very clear statement. The phrase "to have authority over a man" means to take a position of leadership, to give orders, or to dictate from a place of spiritual authority within the worship assembly. Paul is not saying women cannot teach at all. We see examples in the Bible of women teaching other women, or teaching children. Priscilla, along with her husband Aquila, even helped to privately explain the way of God more accurately to Apollos. But what Paul forbids here is a woman taking on the public teaching role or exercising authority over men in the context of the church service. The reason Paul gives for this instruction goes back to the very beginning, to the order of creation and the events of the fall. He continues in verses 13 and 14. For Adam was formed first, then Eve. And Adam was not deceived, but the woman, being deceived, fell into transgression. Paul isn't blaming Eve for everything, but he is pointing back to the original created order and the roles established by God from the start. He's grounding this teaching not in culture, but in creation itself. This reinforces the idea that the principle of male leadership in the church is God's design, intended from the beginning. So when we put these passages together from 1 Corinthians and 1 Timothy, a consistent picture emerges. God's plan for the public worship assembly is for men to lead. This includes leading prayer, preaching the word, and directing the service. When a woman preaches, leads the singing, or serves in a leadership capacity where she has authority over men in the worship service, it goes against the clear instructions laid out in these scriptures. This isn't about superiority or inferiority. Men and women are created equal in the image of God and are equal heirs of the grace of life. This is about divinely appointed roles and functions within the church assembly to maintain order and reflect God's design. The Bible's teaching is that in the public worship service, when qualified men are present, they are the ones who are to lead. To embrace this teaching requires humility and a deep trust in God's wisdom. It means setting aside our own cultural preferences and our own ideas of what seems right or fair, and instead submitting to what God has clearly revealed in His Word. The purpose is not to restrict women, but to create a church environment that operates in peace and order, bringing glory to God according to His perfect plan. Thanks so much for watching today. If this has been helpful, please consider subscribing to the channel for more content that dives deep into the Bible. See you next time.